Okay, so it's time to get started. So in this lecture, we'll look at how you protect network communication. And in summary, if you want the buzzwords, we'll focus mostly on SSL and IPsec. So there is, of course, also SSH, and there is also link layer encryption, and so on and so on. But in the interest of time, we'll only focus on network layer. So, but first we start with a little bit of background on IETF and on how you can actually add security to any protocol at any layer, and what the difference is between different layers and what the pluses and minuses are. But so as you see, the focus is on TLS and IPsec, and I'll try to explain to you what the benefits are and what the limitations are. So we assume that you know about public key cryptography. So these techniques are being used. And I guess somehow we overlook the problem how these public keys are put in place. This is also what we discussed this yesterday for browsers, how browsers have the root key and then those signed server keys. So we kind of assume that this works, although this system actually is, as I showed you, quite flawed and doesn't really achieve its goals. This afternoon, Thomas Herlea will give a more detailed talk on SSL implementations. I'm not a coding person, right? I mean, I used to write code when I was a PhD student. But it's a long time since I've been programming devices. And so I've never set up an IPsec or SSL connection. I never wrote the code for this. I'm just a theory person, okay, in that respect. But I do think I talk to the people who do this kind of stuff, and we do some research on those protocols. So a little bit about internet, just in case you don't know this. In fact, I don't know about you, but in general, I guess most people know the principle of internet. What is not so widely known is how the IETF works and how you can get involved. And maybe this is good to find out. So we'll focus on the principles, and then we go into detail on the protocols. So I guess something to observe, and these are old slides. So this is from 2000. It's always funny to look back at what people predicted in 2000. So you see that people made predictions on fixed internet and mobile internet. So the fixed internet is in yellow, the mobile internet is in blue. And so you see people predicted that the mobile internet would become bigger around 2006, 2007. Of course, it has taken a while longer. So this is a more 10 years later. This is only a few years old. So here you see that the prediction is put around this year or next year, that in fact we'll get more mobile users than desktop users. Okay. So we have, of course, several billions of internet users, and the internet has become very big. So it's important to secure it. For people of many of your generation, it's very hard to imagine that networking could be hard. But to just give you some anecdotes, when I was a student in the 80s, you had IBM, had Token Ring, and DEC had Digital, had DECnet, and everybody had their own networks, and you couldn't hook them up. Right? And there were dial-up lines, so you could, over the phone line, you could talk to computers. But the digital computer and IBM computer, they could only talk over a phone line with 2,400 bits per second. It's kind of hard to imagine, but this was how the world looked, more or less. Of course, the internet was already invented, or the protocols were designed much earlier by DARPA and DARPA research, but they were not widely deployed. And so this is a very important achievement of the internet, that you can actually hook up any two networks, and that everything now talks to each other. And even for TCP/IP, I mean, this is something which is a bit more recent. In the mid-90s, we had an EU project, and we had to make a demo. And I still remember that we had a student spending several months getting TCP/IP to work between two PCs. It's kind of, this is only 15 years ago, right? I mean, it's kind of amazing that now all these things just work. Okay, it's an amazing achievement. Of course, it started all from the OSI model, which was then simplified by the internet people into application layer, transport layer, network layer, and link layer in 4 layers. And so the big question, of course, is where to put security. And I assume that you're familiar with these layers. I'm not going to give you a full basic internet course. I guess the important principle is layering. And so we try to abstract away all the details on a higher layer from the lower layer. And it's encapsulation. So if a data packet gets a transport header, then the whole thing becomes a transport packet and becomes the payload for a network layer, and gets an IP header, and so on. Okay, what is the big problem with security? Security breaks this layering. This is something I think which only gradually has been realized. But for example, if you set up a TLS connection, Okay, this is at the transport layer. Well, of course, you can say you authenticate the entity here, but in fact, you really want to authenticate the user, right? Or the device, or the process. So in fact, even if we would like to stick to layering principle, security kind of breaks this, because essentially you want to authenticate devices and you want to exchange keys. This usually happens at a higher layer. And so this has given a long debate and long problems, and I guess it's still the source of problems. A few words on internet standardization. It's a very democratic and open society, and there has been quite some push. You may have been following this in the news in the past year. So governments want to take control over the internet. So it's actually quite an independent organization, but the ITU, who lost their power in the early 90s, wants to strike back and take control again. And one of the reasons for this is censorship. So some countries want to censor the internet. Apparently for now they've lost the battle, but of course they will keep coming back, because they had control for the whole 20th century more or less, and it's not clear that they will not try to take it back. Okay, so all the work is being done by the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. I'm not going to explain you the whole governance, but it all works based on working groups, and it's very democratic. In fact, you can just subscribe to this, and you actually will get all the discussions. There is 2 meetings a year, but I think even without going to the meetings, you can become very involved. And it's very easy to produce documents and input. The main working document is RFCs. So RFC stands for request for comment. But in fact, it's too late once it's an RFC. Don't comment anymore, because that means, in fact, already the decisions have been made. Okay. Of course, it doesn't mean that all RFCs become standards, and there is several of those. But at least don't read RFC as comments, because in fact, as a company, once something reaches RFC, you can definitely start implementing. It means it's more or less stable. Okay. Something else, part of the success of the internet comes of 2 things: rough consensus, so people can be quite aggressive and rude, and running code. So if you don't have independent interoperating implementations, your document or your solution will not go further. So there is never first 1,000 pages of specs written and then nobody knows how to implement it. You always have to bring your implementation, independent ones, with the spec. So an interesting story about rough consensus. So in the initial discussions of IPsec in the early 90s, Ron Rivest made some comments on the list, and then somebody answered him, "You don't know what a signature is. Read the definition in Bruce Schneier's book." So somebody tells Ron Rivest he doesn't know what a signature is. This is actually the guy who invented RSA and who first formally defined signatures in 1984, right? So this is typical on the internet, and Ron disappeared from the list because I guess he didn't want to have to deal with these kind of people. So there is steps beyond this: proposed standard, standard, draft standard, and standard. I guess this is more for bureaucratic reasons. The important things end up there. Amazingly, in the late 90s, there were only 2 standards, TCP and IP. I think now the status is much better, and there is many more standards. So even in RFC, you have to know how to read the code, because there is several ones that actually mean there is an RFC, but it's not so important. For example, informational, it means in fact you lost the battle. And so people think that what you cooked up is interesting, but it's only for information. We're not going to really mandate this, okay? Or historic, it means that at one moment it was important, but it no longer is. So it's not because something is an RFC, it actually is important, okay? So the main working document is an internet draft. And internet drafts are very interesting. It's a very interesting procedure because they have no formal status. So in fact, tonight, you could actually go and register in a working group, and you could actually produce a draft, author it, and submit it. It will become an official IETF document. Okay. Of course, it means you have to know how to format these documents in the weird ASCII format they use, which is probably a good idea, but imagine they would have chosen WordPerfect in 1988, right? And we would all now be in big trouble to read the old RFCs. So it's ASCII. But they have a very interesting mechanism. After 6 months, your working draft expires. So in fact, if you don't make a new version, or if it's not discussed and improved and enhanced, in fact, it will just disappear. So it's a very democratic mechanism because anybody can push content, but your content will expire automatically. This is a very interesting mechanism. So if there is no interest, it just goes away and nobody has to bother. So of course, you have to be very competent and you have to work with experts to really get something really looked at and studied as a draft and get it to RFC. This is a long-term effort, and you have to have implementers on your side or do it yourself. For any standard, you have to learn the secret words. And it's something which is also not taught in university education. Well, I try to teach my students. But so every standards body has its own code words. So, for example, IETF has required, recommended, elective, limited use, and not recommended. So these are the 5 gradations of something you really have to have and something you should not have, and some things in between. And so it's very important to decide what to implement or what not to implement, or which vendors will offer what, depends on those code words. Okay? And the other thing is must and should. So if something has to happen, it's must. If something should happen but doesn't always happen, it should. Now, why do I explain this to you? Because if you take an ISO standard, in ISO standard the secret words are shall, and those shall not use must in an ISO standard, those shall use shall. So if something in ISO standard says must, it means nothing. You have to use shall. Okay? So this is very secret code words, and if you don't understand those, you can't read a standard. So you have to really know what these things mean. Okay? Security area is very active. You have Stefan Ferrola and Sean Turner as directors. And as you see, these are all the things that are happening. So there is IPsec maintenance, because IPsec, as you will see, is a very complex standard, and they keep enhancing and maintaining it. I discussed yesterday PKIs, it's public key standards. TLS is also still very active. OAuth is about web authorization. Kerberos is still active after many, many years. DKIM, this is for preventing spam, and DANE, this is actually a protocol that tries to improve key distribution for SSL TLS, for example, by basing it on DNSSEC. Okay? And so this is quite dynamic, so every 6 months the new working groups are being created and working groups are being disbanded. So communication security is kind of the easy problem. So historically, crypto was mostly dealing with communication security. I think today, the simple story is that communication security is easy. Endpoint security, application security, operating system security, virtual machines, hypervisor, this is where the real complexity and the problems are, right? And I guess if you look at the program of this course, in fact, there is only a few lectures on communication security. This is the easy problem. Okay? This is the good news. Today we discuss the easy problem. I also have bad news. Even the easy problems we get wrong all the time. Okay? So that leads you to deduce what happens with the hard problems. Okay? So they get it wrong even more. So very often people make architectural errors, so they actually make wrong trust assumptions. I think it's disappearing now, but for a long time the default was always no security. For example, in wireless LAN, the first wireless LANs were rolled out with no security. And then there was a solution, but there was no key management protocol, which you know for sure then there will be no security, because if you don't tell people how to manage their keys, how can they actually get security? Okay? There is quite some protocol errors. A good example is GSM, which only offers unilateral authentication. So the network is never authenticated in GSM. Okay? There is weak mechanisms, and something discovered for SSL is, so there was first SSL2, then flaws were found, and SSL3 was introduced. But then in fact you could tell the other side, or an attacker could tell both sides to use version 2 again. And so then there is no point in having a better version if in fact an attacker can force you to the weaker version. So modes of operation, I think the responsibles there are the cryptographers. In all these standards of the internet, they were done in 93, 94, 95. At that moment, we had no efficient and secure authenticated encryption mechanism. And so people combined encryption and MAC in often the wrong ways, as we know today. So, and this problem is very hard to fix because of legacy. Okay? So there is, of course, a lot of weak crypto out there as well, mostly for the lower layers. And until quite recently, for example, IPsec still had single DES as a mandated algorithm. So this was for export control reasons, political reasons, and so on. And then, of course, this is more the topic of the rest of this course. People make implementation errors, even if all the other things are good. So something people underestimate is wireless communication. So this is, of course, what really makes everybody understand that you need security. So the first crypto boom came in the 1920s because of wireless communication. So it's nothing really new. But what people always underestimate is how far you can pick up wireless communication. I can tell you one story. A friend of mine was a professor in Italy, and he was living in the mountains, and he couldn't get internet access there. So he just put a very small antenna of 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter next to his house, and he could pick up the wireless of the university 2 kilometers down. Okay? It's the same thing with Bluetooth. with a special Bluetooth gun, which costs a couple of $100, you can pick up Bluetooth 1 kilometer away. And this is something people always underestimate, how good antennas can be. Okay? So this is a historical perspective of security. So wireless data, there was from the early 1920s some interest, the one-time pad, then the rotor machines, which were very popular during World War II. Then in the 60s, LFSRs. And today, of course, we have wireless LAN, personal area networks, 3G and even 4G. Wired data, people never saw the point of security in history. People had to believe that wires were secure. So the first secure solutions for wired data were in the financial sector and government sector. These very big boxes, which cost, say, 10,000, 15,000 euros. For example, X25 encryption became popular in the financial sector in the late 80s. Okay? And of course, today we have the protocols I will discuss. For wired voice, in fact, again, governments have no incentive to give citizens secure communications because for either law enforcement reasons or national security reasons, they want to eavesdrop on calls. So the first digital encryption actually was used for an important reason in Yalta. So in fact, Roosevelt shipped voice digitites and encryptors to Yalta, and I'm told that the whole equipment was about the same size as his room. And then he decided not to use it because the quality was too bad. So in the 80s, the US produced secure telephones, which used either secret algorithms or triple DES. And of course, so you see that this was only used by government and a few elite people in industry maybe. But so today, of course, we have voice over IP and we have Skype encryption, which of course has backdoors as well. But at least now, voice encryption is in the hands of the masses, thanks to voice over IP. But governments have to try to control it for a very long time. If you look at the wireless, so of course the first analog systems had no security, GSM had kind of weak security, and from 3G on this was fixed. If you look at wireless LAN, so it was rolled out with no security, then we got web, was fixed after 5 years, WPA, and I guess now we have decent security in WPA2 with AES encryption. In personal area networks, we got Bluetooth, which is crappy security, and Zigbee is a bit better, but we don't see a major pickup there. And so maybe we have to wait for the third generation to get something that is really good and secure. So it seems that we can learn a lesson here that it takes 3 generations to make a system more or less decent. Okay, so what you try to achieve, of course, is confidentiality of the data in the first place. And I guess the big drive or the incident that made mobile phones more secure was Prince Charles talking to Camilla over the phone. And if you want to find out what they were saying, I'm not going to repeat it here. You can look it up on the internet, but it's not so nice to repeat. And so because of those things, there was a big push to have encryption over mobile phones. Of course, you may want to hide who's talking because, again, royalty and famous people, they were being tracked based on their analog phone usage because they were broadcasting a unique number. And so this is, again, something GSM has protection for. And you may want to protect who's talking to whom, but the protocols we look at today actually don't offer this protection. I guess Stephen will speak about Tor that will protect who's talking to whom or which service you're visiting. So you want to find out who's talking to whom, but ideally in both directions, and the phone companies or network providers want to do this, of course, for billing purposes. Data indication. So you want to find out that data has not been modified and that you know where data is coming from. And there is 2 big differences. You have either connectionless or connection-oriented. So depending on the layer where you do it, you want to authenticate datagram by datagram, or you want to authenticate the whole stream. Okay. So another element is access control. And Steve Kent, who is one of the big shots behind IPsec, he says actually people think that IPsec is a mechanism for network security, but in fact it's a method for network access control. It's really, its main purpose is to prevent attackers from using your network. And so then there is also a big dispute or a disagreement in the community. So do you want to have people bound to actually the connection they make so that you can later on prove that they connected? Or you want to have deniability, that in fact parties authenticate, but afterwards they can say, I was never involved in this. Okay, and of course some users prefer this, and clearly network operators want to have proofs, again related to billing. For efficiency reasons, it's impossible to encrypt every packet with public key and to sign every packet with a digital signature. So you will use symmetric crypto. So you take your data, and ideally you also put a trailer, some padding, if only to hide the length of your data. So for example, if you visit a URL, if people can see the length and say this URL is about health information, based on the length of the URL, they may be able to see which diseases you're looking at. Okay? So this could be highly sensitive. So you could stop this by adding a trailer. You will typically then add a MAC on the header and the data in the trailer. So you will authenticate the whole thing here. Of course, you can't authenticate the complete header because the header may have things like hop count, and hop count changes at every step. So you can only authenticate the immutable fields of the header, which stay the same between sender and recipient. And you will encrypt the data in the trailer. Okay? And so the question is, how do you get a key for the MAC and the encryption? And then which mechanisms will you be using? And so historically, people used an encryption mechanism for this part and a MAC for this part. And so the advice today is to use authenticated encryption with associated data for the whole thing and have one basic primitive. Okay? And the associated data is the header information, which you want to authenticate. So where to put security? There have been quite religious battles about this. So, and in the late 80s, early 90s, there were endless discussions whether you should put security at the network layer or the transport layer, or the top of network layer or the bottom of the transport layer. There was some kind of religious fights which should be here or there, which of course is the same place in practice. But so this was the idea. So you can look at the different pluses and minuses of where putting security. So of course, ideally you want to secure applications because applications talk to users, and users should know what they're doing. If you buy something, you want to see what you buy, and you want to commit to it. You want to be sure that this is correct, right? So you actually want to authenticate the transaction data of your payment, or you want to protect your email. And as a user, you don't care about what's happening on the lower layers. Okay? On the other hand, of course, as if you want secure networks, this is very nice because if you have a secure network, IPsec, it means that every application is protected at once. Okay? So it means that you don't have to implement email security, transaction security, web security, whatever, chat security, voice over IP security. If you actually have security at this layer, then everything is protected. So this is independent of the applications. I guess the problem, of course, is authentication. What do you authenticate or who do you authenticate? This is a process running at a low layer. And if a machine has multiple users, this is a problem. Okay? And then in practice, what we do today mostly, or with the more popular way of protecting stuff is, in fact, in our browsers, you use TLS. Or at least TLS was designed for browsers. But of course, it can also be used for email protection, so it's at the transport layer. Okay? Where you have actually a reliable connection, and this has quite some advantages in terms of protection. So you see that the higher layer you protect, the closer you are to the user. The lower layer you protect, the less you are dependent on the application. And also, at the lower the layer, the more information there is, so the more you protect. So if you encrypt only at the higher layers, people can see who's talking to whom and what's happening. They can see that you're sending an email, and they may see other information as well. So ideally, you should encrypt at lower layers because it's application independent and you hide more traffic data. Okay? At the application layer, you're close to the users and you have much more granular controls. It's end-to-end. Okay? So governments hate this. Some security people in companies hate this because if you have end-to-end security, then they can't see what you're doing. So if you create a secure pipe, say, from your home machine to your desktop in the office, you can actually inject viruses through the firewall going into your desktop, which may then affect the company as a whole. So there is always this fight. So security people, on the one hand, they like end-to-end, but they don't like it for their own people because they want to see what everybody in their company is doing. Okay, so, and a big problem of lower layers is that it's only, for example, link layer encryption is hop to hop. It means that every intermediate node sees all the data. So in GSM, in fact, encryption is only to the base station, and then afterwards it's in clear. But even if you would continue from the base station to the base station controller, you would have to decrypt in the base station and re-encrypt in the base station controller, right? So, and then the base station would still see the information. So I guess in practice, you want to do encrypt at multiple layers. I even know a company that encrypts at 3 layers. So they try to be very secure, and they have data link encryption everywhere. They have network security encryption, and they have application protection. But that used to be very expensive 15 years ago when they did this. But today I think it's actually affordable because encryption is essentially cheap. Okay, so I explained already the concept of encapsulation. So as I said, bulk data is symmetric crypto for efficiency and authenticated encryption. So the advice today is either use authenticated encryption as one primitive or use encrypt then MAC. Okay, so first encrypt and then MAC the ciphertext. This is to protect you against chosen ciphertext attacks. So some mechanisms use MAC then encrypt, like SSH, I believe, and some use MAC and encrypt. So in fact, they don't encrypt the MAC. You can show for particular modes of operation that all these work, but the more robust one in general is encrypt and MAC, and the real good solution is to use authenticated encryption. So of course, the problem is not in a symmetric crypto in some sense. The problem is how to manage all this. How do the two parties get their keys and the parameters? How do you know which algorithm is being used and so forth? So this is actually the difficult problem, distributing keys and managing all this stuff. Okay. So in the IETF, there were two approaches to algorithm selection. So IPsec used a la carte, which means that you can say, I need an encryption algorithm, I need a MAC algorithm, I need a key derivation function to go from my public key agreed value to an AES key, say. I need the Diffie-Hellman group, and so on, and you could pick all of those and then negotiate. Of course, it's less compact to encode, it's more flexible, but of course it's a nightmare to test because you have to test any combination. So IPsec, the key agreement protocol IKE version 1 used this method. So TLS from the beginning used suites. A suite is just a set, a whole set, right? It's like a fixed menu in a restaurant. You can't choose, this is what you can eat, it's a good deal, but you can't make substitutions. Okay? The problem, of course, is then if you get lobbying. As an example, in IPsec there was some lobbying from Japan, and so Camellia was added as a block cipher. So Camellia is a block cipher quite similar to AES, but not quite the same, and it didn't win in the AES competition. But in Japan it's widely used, so they kind of, with some lobbying, they actually got Camellia into IETF. That means that the number of suites suddenly doubles, right? If you now decide that you actually have to have a bigger elliptic curve group, the number of suites doubles again, and so you get an exponential number of suites, and I'm not sure it's actually so efficient anymore. So suites only work if you actually have a tight control on what can be used. This is the approach taken in TLS and IKE version 2. Now we switch to TLS. I guess this is a mechanism all of you know, because I guess even my mother knows what it is, because you can see this lock in the browser, and so you feel very good. Okay, this is the essence of TLS. What does it offer? It offers connection-oriented data confidentiality and integrity. So it's at the TLS layer, so there is a concept of connection, and so you can't inject or duplicate or remove packets. And it offers client and server authentication, which are both optional. Server authentication is kind of quite standard, so servers tend to have public keys and certificates, and sometimes those are signed by the keys in the browser. You get no warning. Client certificates tend to be very rare. Anybody here has a client certificate? One person? Two? Three? Of course, I tell you some news. You have an identity card as a Belgian. Those are your Belgians. In fact, you could import this in your browser. And if you would want, you could actually use this for all your transactions. But there is kind of no point in doing this, right? I mean, because you will also reveal quite some confidential data, like your date of birth to the server company. And why would you do this? Yes?
Are secure socket layer and TLS, are these synonyms, or what sort of the relationship here?
Yeah, I'll come back to this. So the quick answer is SSL is a standard put together by Netscape, who was a leading browser in 93, 94. They hired some very smart consultants who quickly put together something, but it was a proprietary standard. And then IETF adopted this several years later as TLS 1.0, but SSL 3.0 and TLS 1.0 are not completely identical. There's some minor differences, okay? And given the whole history, it's also important to understand that the main goal of the SSL at the time was to make the CA companies make money. That was the main goal. Of course, they wanted to solve a security problem, but they also had an important constraint. We have all these CA people who want to hit gold, and the protocols are designed in such a way that they can actually become rich. And they succeeded, right? So many of those guys became billionaires, or at least. So goal was achieved. That goal was achieved. Okay. TLS working group is very old. So in the transport layer, you also have secure shell. And so as I explained, these are two related protocols. SSL 3.0 is almost the same as TLS 1.0. So what you have is, of course, first a negotiation, anti-authentication and key establishment, and then you have this encapsulation, decapsulation layer. This negotiation thing is very new. Again, maybe for you it may be hard to imagine for your generation, but in the 80s, encryption was done by boxes which cost 10 or 15,000 euros, and there was one algorithm in there, maybe two. One for classified data and one for non-classified or something like this. But that was it. You had to switch algorithm 1, algorithm 2, or in your GSM you had A51 and A52, and that was it. Okay? So this because crypto was done in hardware, and I guess we now know that crypto in hardware is more secure than crypto in software. We now fully understand the concerns of the Secret Service agencies about crypto in software. You have problems hiding your keys, you have more side channels, and so on and so on. But okay. Crypto in software is great because it's much more flexible. So in software, you can easily get a library which implements 25 algorithms. Okay? In hardware, this is not feasible. So you need now a new mechanism to negotiate what you're going to use. And this is something very new from the early 90s. So you have to negotiate which algorithm you're going to use. So you start up and you say, hey, I speak algorithm A, B, C, D, and E, and I speak algorithm E, F, G, and H. Can we actually agree on something? Okay? Then after a while, it was realized that there should be a secure negotiation, because if the opponent can scrap in the conversation all the strong algorithms, you're left with only weak algorithms. And again, through the 90s, the US government made sure that nobody could export from the US algorithms with larger keys than 40 bits or 512-bit RSA. So in fact, every browser had actually weak encryption available. It had to. And in fact, any browser in Europe had only weak encryption. And so an attacker could actually negotiate down the security. So then the concept of secure negotiation came. You have to protect the negotiation. And this is a major difference between SSL 2.0 and 3.0, that they fixed this attack. So SSL was designed for web security, for HTTP, but of course it can also be used for IMAP, Telnet, and so on. In fact, it's a generic mechanism. So there was quite some competition at the time. It was not obvious that SSL would win. In fact, Microsoft had PCT, which was quite well known for its buggy implementations. RSA Labs designed an SMIME-like protocol. SMIME is an email protocol called SHTTP ATP. And of course, there is also at the higher layer, there was for credit card transactions, people were looking at SET. XML is content protection. And essentially, I think the real security gurus, they wanted to have some message level security added on top of HTTP. So some XML style stuff, but they kind of lost the battle because SSL won. So here is the history, as you asked. So there's 2.0 has quite some security flaws. 3.0 is still being used. If you switch it off in your browser, you'll find out that you have problems with some websites. What happens essentially is that some companies just hire a consultant to install a secure website. He does it and it disappears. And then nobody knows how to touch it, so they just don't touch it, and they still have only 3.0. So 1.0 is essentially SSL 3.0 with small changes. I'll come back to the features later. So this explains more or less what's happening in the protocol. So you have two layers. You have the record layer protocol and the transport layer. The record layer is inserted in between the application and the transport layer. And so there is two phases, two main phases. The handshake is a setup where you actually have the client and server hello, and you negotiate the cipher. Okay? And then you have the application. This is where you just push the data. And then there is also an alert for special cases. I guess in regular use it should not be used. So it's already pretty complex, and then later on, renegotiation was introduced. So to efficiently restart negotiations, change the key, maybe go to a more efficient algorithm, and avoid doing the whole public key stuff again. So if you have a very long-term connection with lots of data, some details were added. In fact, many details were added for performance reasons, because I mean, we now take for granted that connections are encrypted, but you should imagine that, look at 93, 94, 95, how slow PCs were and how slow servers were. So for example, many banks had no HTTPS on their login page, but they couldn't afford the performance, right? So only for transactions could they actually offer HTTPS. So it was a major performance bottleneck, so there is quite some optimizations in TLS that made it more complex than it should be. Okay. So the record layer does fragmentation, because it could well be, for example, that by adding a MAC, your packet becomes too big and you have to split it up. And also, this has given rise to attacks. Okay. Compression is not used in practice, but there may be interest for this. So what is the reason to compress in this record layer? Well, if you try to compress it afterwards, it's ciphertext, and you can't compress ciphertext. So the idea was to optimize the web. You would actually first compress and then encrypt. And there is actually some neat attacks that actually show that based on the time of compression, you can find information on the plain text. But as far as I know, it's not widely implemented. Okay. And then cryptographic security, so typically it was encrypt then MAC. So the handshake protocol, there is several versions of it. We'll come back to this. It's a public key protocol where typically you don't authenticate the client, but only the server. So here you have the whole protocol. I'm not going to go to the details. I'm sure that Thomas will do more about this afternoon. So the hello request comes from the server. Then the client hello starts a handshake, gives the protocol version supported and the algorithm supported. Then the server gives the same information in the server hello. The server sends its certificate and it starts the exchange for the master secret or the pre-master secret. This is the Diffie-Hellman exchange or the RSA exchange, as we discussed yesterday. So this key material is being sent. Request certificate for the client, but the client usually doesn't have one, so you get no answer to this. And then the server is done. The client, if you have a certificate, you send this. Then it does its part of the Diffie-Hellman or RSA key exchange. Certificate of the server is being verified. And remember what I told you yesterday. You also have to do an OCSP request. And if there is no answer, it says OK. This is a default implementation today. So then you may decide to change the cipher spec. Okay. And then you're done. What happens now is, to protect the negotiation, a hash value of the whole conversation is exchanged between the two. Okay. And this actually stops an attack from modifying these ciphers which are available, because if you would have modified those messages here, then this hash would be different and it actually would be detected. You can now ask the question, why can't the opponent change the hash? Well, first, two parties have to have the same view. And second, there is probably some secret information in this hash which the opponent doesn't know. So this kind of protects your negotiation. And then the whole thing is completed. So what are the default algorithms? So HMAC SHA-1 is the default algorithm for macking. It's about 12 cycles per byte. And as I showed you yesterday, we have no good attack on it. So the best attack known breaks 40 out of 80 rounds and has a huge complexity. So for now, it's still secure. In spite of this, you see more and more developers going to HMAC SHA-2. I think it's a complete overkill. The only reason why you would do this is to go to HMAC SHA-512, because on 64-bit machines, SHA-512 may be even faster than SHA-1. Okay, so for confidentiality, historically the choice was DES-CBC. Today it's triple DES-CBC, but there is still legacy, which is RC4, with 40-bit keys and 128-bit keys. Okay, and then also there is an old algorithm RC2, the ID block cipher is still allowed. And then there is DES-CBC with a 40-bit key, which is kind of a weakened version of DES. So, in fact, to comment on this, we'll look at the CBC attacks. So all the CBC implementations in TLS are vulnerable to these padding oracle attacks, where if you send enough queries of changed ciphertext, you can actually get plain text. So the advice of some people is to switch back to RC4, because RC4 doesn't have padding, right? It's a string cipher, it encrypts bit by bit. So you could actually avoid this problem, but as I showed you yesterday, RC4 has quite some statistical weaknesses. So I'm not sure it's a very good decision. Okay, so for Authentication protocol, there is many choices. As you can see, there was no agreement on what to choose. So you can just have plain Diffie-Hellman without any protection. I showed to you this is vulnerable to a meet-in-the-middle attack. In fact, you create a secure key, but you don't know with whom. So what is actually more popular is server authentication without client authentication, and there is several options. There is RSA, there is Diffie-Hellman with DSS, so you sign your exchange with DSA or with RSA, and then there is also Diffie-Hellman E, which is ephemeral with DSS and RSA, and strange enough, DHA DSS is the default one. So what's this DHA E mean? It means ephemeral. It means that Alice and Bob, the client and server, pick a random X and Y, and they compute for every time a new Diffie-Hellman key, so a new X and Y. So this means you have forward secrecy. It means that if somebody compromises your server, he will not be able to read past communications. While in these DHA variants, your long-term keys, your X and Y, are long-term fixed keys, and if you find out of them, you can read all past computation. So I guess it's a good choice. Of course, this costs more work. And so this is why, I don't know what to say now, is I should really have asked, but one of my bright students, Emilia Kasper, who did also this fast AES implementation, she went to Google for an internship, because Google actually is using RSA. Why? For performance reasons. Because it requires only one exponentiation. And so her task was to optimize Diffie-Hellman ephemeral based on DSS using elliptic curve crypto. And when she entered the internship, it was 5 times slower than RSA. It was also a larger key length, so a more secure key version. And so after the summer, it was 20 or 30% still 20 or 30% slower. So she made an amazing speed up. But the decision by Google was to not adopt it, because 30% slower means 30% more server farms, right? And this costs a lot of money. And so I think that after all the Google hacks, that Google has revisited its position. Because of course, if the Chinese attackers, to not name names, would have had the keys, they could now read all past communications. So Google was really motivated to go to the US elliptic curve ephemeral. And so, as I told you, you can also use client certificates. But so, it was kind of, to me, an eye-opener, because essentially, you know, when I started doing public key crypto, the first code was being written around PGP. We also had our own code at the same time, early 90s. You really had to do a lot of effort to make RSA faster than 1 second, right, on a PC at the time. And so today, of course, RSA runs in 10, 15 milliseconds. So on your client device, even on your mobile phones, RSA is fast today, blazingly fast. But the bottleneck is at the server side, because a server which is popular has, of course, thousands or 10,000s of clients. And so, in fact, they have a performance problem. If they go from 1 public key operation to 5 public key operations, this actually is a major problem. Of course, on the other hand, there is Moore's law. Yes? They can put hardware. I mean, I don't know. So as you know, Google doesn't tell us what they do. But given what Emilia had to do, I suspect that she was doing software optimization. So I don't think Google wants to put dedicated public key hardware there, because it would probably increase the cost too much. Maybe not the cost of the chip, but also the interfacing and the fact that it's yet another component on your board and so on. They want to use off-the-shelf components. That's my guess. By the way, there is also a good end to this story, because Emilia was hired by Google. So I mean, even if she failed to make it faster, then what she actually was hired because they realized she's a very, very good cryptographer and a very good programmer as well. Okay, so this is the cipher suite. So in 2002, AES was added. So, but you now got the doubling problem, right? And then later on, Camellia was added, and so you can see that the number of suites, to even understand all of them, you'll take quite a while. So, due to several attacks, so essentially the padding oracle attacks, so first pointed out by Rockaway and then by Vodenay, and then 2011 it was shown with JavaScript you can make these attacks really practical and efficient. It was decided to patch all these things, and there were more, so there is a whole range of attacks on TLS 1.0, and so it took them about 5 years to decide on TLS 1.1 that would actually fix those padding oracle attacks. Okay. Then what happened, of course, is in 2004 and 2005 there was the hash function crisis. And so, in fact, a big problem is how do you protect the negotiation? And I'll tell you what is being done in TLS. So to protect the negotiation, you hash with MD5. But of course, they knew that, in fact, MD5 was not very secure. So to really have a safety belt, they also hash with SHA-1. Okay, so with both. Now, two results were known or were announced in 2004, 2005. One, that both MD5 and SHA-1 are broken. That's one thing. And there was another result which is not so widely known by Antoine Joux. He showed that if you concatenate two hash functions, which are iterated, like MD5 and SHA-1, in fact, the weaker one doesn't help you at all. So there is no point in doing this. It's a very surprising result. It goes against what all the textbooks say, but it's correct. Okay? And if I would have more time, I would explain it to you, but just believe me. So if you combine two hashes like this, the weaker one doesn't help you. So in fact, they just use SHA-1 to protect the negotiation, and SHA-1 is broken, as I showed you yesterday. So of course, you would say, let's negotiate a new algorithm, because we can now negotiate. We just add SHA-2, and then we negotiate. But the problem is, this was used to protect the negotiation. And you can't negotiate the algorithm to protect the negotiation. It's pulling yourself up by your own hair. Okay, they overlooked this detail. That if you protect with crypto a negotiation algorithm, you can't negotiate that algorithm. So they had to make a new version of the standards, very reluctantly, TLS 1.2, 2008. It did more good things, so it added the AES cipher suites. It also supported authenticated encryption, and it replaced this thing by SHA-2. Okay. So 1.1 and 1.2 are way better, but unfortunately there is still almost no deployment. Deployment is very, very slow of those new things. Okay. So now some more analysis. So people say, is this secure or not, SSL? So there was a panel last week at RSA, and some of the SSL gurus and some of the people who found recent attacks asked the question, is SSL broken? Well, I think it's not the worst protocol. If you would design something yourself, it would be much worse. But still, there is many flaws. So, of course, it does provide empty authentication, but only from the server side. In practice today, it does encrypt and authenticate your data, but you're vulnerable to certain attacks. Okay? You don't have non-repudiation of origin. So there is signatures being used, but you never sign any transaction. Okay? You don't hide who's talking to whom. Okay? You don't have multicast, and of course the weak point is the endpoints. Right? And also you don't hide, for example, the length of the URLs. So there is still many things that could be improved over it. So if you want a secure protocol, keep it simple. Okay? And SSL was initially simple, but then later on it was modified to deal with things like renegotiation, to efficient renegotiate keys, and it turns out that all those complexities result in cryptographic flaws and also result in implementation flaws. So in fact, getting a secure implementation of SSL is not so easy, but it's still much better than everything you would cook up yourself. Okay? If you would need, for a particular application which is not open, your own protocol, I would say take SSL and remove all the options. Right? If you would do this, you probably get a quite decent protocol, much better than what you would do yourself. So there is still quite some problems. So a famous problem was a Netscape problem from the mid-90s. So Netscape used to weak random number generator. Same problem we see come back with RSA keys, right? And so people could actually recover the session keys. There is the padding Oracle attack on PKCS number 1. There is a patch for this in version 1.1, but 1.1 is not deployed. The rollback attempts, so you could actually, you had an unprotected negotiation. This is in SSL 2.0. This is patched in SSL 3.0. So length of ciphertext is still visible. There is still all the PKI problems, which are there. Okay, you can still do web spoofing and phishing. The TLS cannot protect against this. Right? If as a user you actually enter your confidential data in a wrong website, there is not much that can be done. A very big problem is the following. Your bank, if it's secure, it always uses HTTPS and SSL for all the sessions. Well, what would happen if an attacker sets up a fake bank website that only uses HTTP? And then poisons the DNS, so you actually go to this site. Okay? So now you think you're talking to your bank, but in fact you're not. So this is a problem which is still not completely solved. There is now a standard for it, HSTS, strict transport security. So what this protocol says is if I ever interact with a website in HTTPS, I will never accept this website in HTTP. Okay, plus there is also kind of a whitelist mechanism. When you get your browser, a number of websites is already listed as only reachable through HTTPS. And so this is a problem completely beyond cryptography. It's about usability and user interface and to stop a trivial attack. But of course, it's not so easy because for new websites, it doesn't kind of work, right? It only works for older websites. There is no plain text, but I don't think that's a real problem. You can't avoid this anyway in a protocol, I think. So there is lots of attacks appearing on TLS. Because TLS is widely used, these attacks get a very high visibility. So about every year, people find new attacks. And some do actually more at publicity than others. And so depending on the name they choose for the attack or depending on the impact, this thing ends up in the news. These attacks are not always as serious as they are announced by their developers. On the other hand, many of these attacks exploit flaws which are known for more than 10 years. So if we could now redo TLS or make a version 2.0, start from scratch with everything that we learned, we could do a much better job, right? But the thing is, people look at the attacks. If the attacks are really bad, then they issue a patch. But if they're not so bad, they just say, they add a warning in the standard, right? That's it. Okay, so this attack was discovered by Marsh Ray 4 years ago. Essentially, I'm not going to give you all the details, but you can look it up. If you Google the renegotiation attack, you can somehow inject traffic in a session as if it came from a client. So you actually choose plain text and send this to the other party by exploiting the renegotiation mechanism. The only reason this mechanism is there is for efficiency reasons. So you want to optimize performance. You don't want to run all the public key stuff again. You want to use a session key to generate a new session key. So this adds complexity, but it improves performance. So you can see this is a real problem because in less than 3 months, in fact, there was a fix issued. So if it was a fake problem, IETF doesn't respond so quickly. So this actually, and the problem is the fix is very simple. You actually disable renegotiation. Okay? So apparently today most servers are patched, but there is one big problem. As a client, you don't know whether a server is patched or not. So in fact, as a client, you don't know whether you're vulnerable or not to the attack because you don't know whether the server is patched. So if you're worried about this attack, as a client side, you're helpless. You have to hope the server is actually patched because there is no secure way for the server telling you, I'm patched, we're secure. Okay? Yesterday I mentioned the Debian problem. So this is this guy commenting out all these MD updates to collect randomness. So this, for a few weeks, I generated about 32,000 keys coming from a small set, which you can all reconstruct. Okay. So this is, of course, a browser implementation issue or an OpenSSL implementation issue. I'm sorry. So, and it's, of course, a major problem. I think this is a very cool one discovered by Moxie. It's nothing to do with crypto again. The previous one, you can say, has to do with the crypto implementation, but this is completely code-oriented. So this is how browsers accept bogus SSL certs. So what you do as, say, from KU Leuven, I would issue a certificate request to, say, VeriSign for paypal.com, and then I put the end of string kuleuven.be. And so VeriSign would check that I'm indeed coming from kuleuven.be, so they would issue the certificate to me. Now, if a browser starts to parse this, it actually will read this as a PayPal certificate, and it will verify correctly. Okay, because this is the end of string, so in fact it will ignore everything that comes behind. And so Moxie published this at Black Hat 2009. And what was the response? The PayPal account of Moxie was closed. Right. That's what you do if you see such an attack, right? He didn't use KU Leuven, but I mean. So you can check this story on the internet if you don't believe me. So it's a typical implementation mistake. It's not cryptographic, but it requires that people who implement stuff are very careful about what they do and are very careful in writing code and looking at the corner cases. So in 2011, we got the Beast attack. Cryptographically, it's not a new attack in the sense that it actually is based on the fact that in SSL TLS, the IV is not secret and random, but is a previous ciphertext block, which cryptographers advised heavily against in 2001. But I think, in fact, there is other papers and other work from the 90s where it was shown you shouldn't do this, okay? So this attack was actually known, and there were several descriptions, but I think what Dong and Rizzo did was two things. They first showed with JavaScript they could really make it practical and really recover plain text. And then the second thing they did, they chose a very good name. And so people started paying attention, okay? And so in fact, the amazing thing is that this attack is no longer possible in TLS 1.1, which was published in 2006. But in 2011, there was almost no adoption anyway, so they could actually launch their attack. But I guess the main lesson learned is choosing a good name helps for your PR. So this is why people who find attacks on SSL try to choose good names. So there was a recent one announced about a month ago, the Lucky 13 attack. Again, a good name, right? So it's another CBC padding oracle attack, yet another one, okay, by Kenny Patterson and his PhD student. The industry is not so concerned about it because it actually needs 8 million connections. But on the other hand, if you know part of the plaintext, so for example, because the plaintext is structured, or you know that the password has a certain form, or you know that there is some kind of padding around the password, or the secret, then in fact it can be much faster, it can be only a few thousand. So I guess the industry assumes that if you attempt from one side more than 8 million connections, you will be shut down anyway because of DOS countermeasures. So it allows you to decrypt ciphertext and cookies. And now the interesting thing, it applies to 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2. So the new patches, which still have not been rolled out, the new versions are also vulnerable. So if we want to protect against this, we will need 1.3. Okay, and so I'm very curious to see whether IETF will respond or not. Because what's the point in making yet another version if people don't even implement 1.1, right? So if you want the details, you can go to this website. You'll get the link. This is a slide I made this morning, so it's not in the PDFs you got, but it will be uploaded soon. And anyway, you can Google for Lucky 13, right? And why is it Lucky 13? Because the header length is 13 bytes, and this is not a multiple of 8 or something, and this kind of helps the attacker a bit. 13 is, for them, a lucky number. I guess it's an unlucky number for the users. There is one attack I just want to mention, just to show you that there is more. I didn't make a slide for it because I don't want to show too many slides. But together with one of my bright students, Nikos and Frey, we actually found an attack on TLS, which is pretty interesting. It doesn't work quite well on TLS, but it works very well on a variant of TLS. And so what is the attack? It's an amazingly simple attack, but it requires quite some mathematics to pull it off. So TLS is pushing towards elliptic curve cryptography. Okay? Because elliptic curves have shorter keys, and so we hope that in the long run, in the next 10 years, 20 years, elliptic curve will be much more efficient than RSA or Diffie-Hellman. Now, it turns out that TLS does not indicate properly in the protocol whether a key is a Diffie-Hellman key or an RSA key, or an ECC key. And so it turns out that we can actually take an ECC key and have the other side believe it's an RSA key, which we can factor, because the elliptic curve keys are much shorter. Okay? So there is no kind of clear key separation. And so you can, one side can use an ECC key, but the other side will use it as if it's an RSA key. And we can find out this key and we can factor the modulus of it. So it doesn't work for TLS because they're very lucky. So because of the algorithm numbering. So every algorithm has a number. And it turns out that the number they gave to ECC is, I forgot the details, but it's like, say it's 7. And that means the modulus becomes too big. But if they would have given the number 4, the attack works. And this number is just chosen whatever, right? Because it came on that time or because of the date, or it's a stupid choice of a number, so it's not inherent part of the security of TLS. Okay? So it shows you there is many other problems we're trying to find out. There is also a problem with fragmentation, and so on and so on. Okay. So it's the best studied protocol, TLS, and I think we now know from studying TLS that making a secure protocol is very hard. I mean, securing a pipe is kind of easy. We know how to do this. But if you have compression, fragmentation, multiple algorithms, if you still stick to CBC mode, which you shouldn't do, then it actually becomes quite hard. In addition, if you want to hide the length of the plain text and so on, all these kind of other things, if you look at all the possible security features you may want, in fact, it's very difficult to just make a secure connection. So there is only one advice. If you need a secure connection, there is actually, I guess there is two options. One, you use TLS in a higher version and you choose secure algorithms, right? That's one option. The other one, which is more expensive but may pay off more in the end, is you take TLS and you strip it down. You remove all the things you don't need, you have to simplify it, and then hopefully you get something which is more efficient or more, but less flexible. But of course, it's not a standard, and so you will have to have quite some effort in evaluating it. But I think just studying all the attacks on TLS is already a job which will take you several weeks. Okay, so it works quite well. I will skip this. There is no non-repudiation, so it's still amazing that Rivest and Shamir invented RSA and Diff and Hellman invented the concept in the 70s. We now have PCs that can sign things in 10 milliseconds, but if you order something in Amazon or if you make a bank transaction, there is no signatures. You just sign Diffie-Hellman values and you authenticate with a password in this channel, and then there is MAX. In the best case, there is a MAC on the transaction. It's kind of amazing, right, that we invented great technology. We can now build it, we roll it out, and we don't use it. But this is how the world is. Okay, so this I will also skip. So academics kept proposing improvements to TLS, and I guess after the recent attacks there will be more improvements. For example, identity protection, compression, maybe clean up the cipher suites, use a more secure algorithm with RSA. But the main problem is backward compatibility. So it's very hard to change the wheels on a bicycle while you're riding it. So the big problem of TLS is that it's so successful. That's one problem. And the second problem is that if browser vendors change TLS, so they, for example, they say, I will stop supporting 1.0, I only support 1.1 or 1.2, they break the internet. And as a browser vendor, you break the internet, you lose customers. Because I guess this is what you all do, right? I mean, you're using Chrome one day and a website doesn't work, you just open Firefox, right? When it happens a few times, you just never go back to Chrome. I think this is an important, I mean, we all know that there is alternatives, so they're kind of getting very interchangeable. And so if one of them breaks a website for security reasons, you just swap it out and they lose market share. In the end, they will disappear. So in fact, the browser vendors would like to improve security, but they can't because they lose market share. And then the server side there, I guess the main vendors are very keen, the big sites, to be secure, and they actually are up to date. But of course, all the smaller sites, they don't understand security, it's not their priority. And very often these things have been done by consultants and they cannot be touched anymore. And so they stay the same version for many, many years. So there is many optimizations suggested. I'm not going to go into them. The academics keep doing this. But essentially the message is we could probably stop doing this because they're ignored anyway, right? Unless you can really, really improve performance by a major factor, it's being ignored. And there is some neat tricks. Okay. Now let's move to IPsec for the last 25 minutes. So you can argue that IPsec is the place where security should have been put, okay? Because transport layer is not really application independent. And really TLS is designed for HTTP mostly. As I said, it can be reused, but if you want to be application independent, if you're a purist, you really want to have security at the network layer. I think there is a major difference. SSL was designed by a handful of consultants who were paid by Netscape and were told to do something and get it working. And so they took about a year. IPsec was designed by a committee. So it looks like a camel where they wanted to make a horse, right? So IPsec is amazingly complex. They started also in 93, 94. '96, I broke their MAC algorithm because they decided to design their own MAC algorithm, which was then broken. And so then they were very angry with me because they say, you delayed our work by 1 year. I said, I'm sorry, but I mean, why do you design your own MAC algorithm in the first place? But in the end, of course, they only published their standard in '98, so I don't think that I was the main reason for delay, right? This attack happened in '95, so I think they had many other reasons to not be done on time. So there is a big problem. They came too late because TLS was rolled out already. I mean, they were ready in '94. They came 4 years too late. Plus, as you will see, it's very complex. There is now 48 documents. Last time I counted, maybe there is now 50. Okay, so it's quite complex. As a manager, if you want to punish your employee, just tell them, make me an IPsec implementation. Okay, it's not going to be fun. There is several reasons for this. It's very hard to figure it out. I think one is that these people were idealists, so they wanted to make the perfect protocol. So also you can see this at the name. The name is not IPsec key exchange, it's IKE, infinite key exchange. So their goal was to make a protocol that would work for any internet interaction. Okay, so a bit lack of modesty, or maybe too much ambition, and this has delayed them a lot, and it actually took much more time than expected. Then, of course, there were many use cases. If you want to secure the whole internet, you want to deal with all the use cases, with NAT and with everything else. It was still export control times, so in the end they have many, many options, which make the protocol unnecessarily complex. Okay, and then the third thing, of course, is that by that time the major vendors got involved, so it was not only Netscape quickly solving their problem and saying, make us a protocol that can make us rich by selling certificates. In fact, there was a single goal which succeeded. Here, of course, all the big players were there, and probably big players like very complex options because that actually means a barrier to entry in the market, right? This means that only people who can spend several man-years can build an implementation. And as a new vendor, if you want to start selling IPsec, it's going to have a big investment before you can do it. Okay? So I think that may also have played a role. It's hard to see. So IPsec has 3 use cases, which makes it also complex. One is host-to-host, okay? Just between 2 devices. Say your home device and the device of your friend, or your home device and the device in your office. But of course, this will be hated by the security manager of your company. So what they want you to use is, in fact, host-to-gateway. So you can sit at home and log into the gateway of the company, and then this will be protected by the internal company security or by no security, whatever. This is host-to-gateway. And then you have the other thing, which is the branch-to-branch option, where say you have 2 branches of a bank which are connected over the network. This is driven by the case where leased lines were very expensive. Again, this may be hard for you to imagine, but companies paid an arm and a leg to get a connection of, say, 100 kilobit per second. And so suddenly the internet came, and connection on the internet was much cheaper. So you want to use the internet and encrypt from gateway to gateway to actually get rid of your dedicated leased lines. So these are the 3 main use cases. But so you see, if you have 3 use cases, it may not be easy to find a solution that's efficient for all of them, right? And so this is why there is many options. So again, as I said, Stephen Kent claims that IPsec is mostly a mechanism for access control. And I think understanding this may help you understand certain decisions made in IPsec. Okay. SSL is connection-oriented integrity. This is connection-less integrity. So it's datagram by datagram, packet by packet. There is some replay detection, which is a layer violation, because it should happen. But for security reasons, there is some good arguments to actually check for repetitions. There is data origin authentication. So as I said, there is rejection of replayed packets, which is not supposed to happen at this layer anyway. There is confidentiality, and there is a little bit of traffic flow confidentiality. But if you really want to hide what you're doing, you should use Tor, as I said. So there is extension headers. So you're going to define an extension of the packets. And there is 2 of them because they couldn't choose. There is authentication header and encapsulation security payload. Authentication header has no reason for existence. The main reason why it existed was that it doesn't encrypt, so it was to deal with export regulations of the 90s. So in fact, today you could dump HA, because, well, unless of course you want to have interactions with North Korea or some other countries which are on the blacklist of some other countries. But in general, if you can encrypt, why should you have a special protocol that cannot encrypt? And then you have security association, where you indicate what your keys are, what your destination address is, and which kind of protocol you're going to use. So you have quite some parameters: sequence numbers, counter overflow, anti-replay window, algorithms keys, lifetime, the protocol mode, we'll come back to this, and the maximum transmission unit. So you see that the email is complex, and so also there is many parameters. We'll come back to these two modes, so we'll end up with kind of 4 modes anyway. So the algorithms, so you see that in '98, I think IETF made a fool of themselves. So TLS was rolled out already for a while, was used for internet banking. In Europe, you could only get 40-bit keys in your browser, but of course there were European companies who sold you patches to browsers to actually have 128-bit security, right? At that time, so this is 95, 96, 97. In 98, IETF comes with IKE version 1, and what is the default algorithm? Single DES CBC. Okay, this is 5 years after the paper by Mike Wiener showing that for $1 million you can find the DES key in 3 hours. So it was kind of really ridiculous. Also, the Diffie-Hellman group was quite small, so also DES CBC, and there is again all the padding problems related to it. At least in the 2000, the new version of IKE, in fact, you have AES now, HMAC SHA-1, bigger groups, but still the CBC mode. Okay. So this is 2003. So in 5 years, at least, they made a major improvement to the algorithms. So you can use both the HA mode and the ESP mode in 2 variants, or the HB transform and ESP transform, I should call it, in 2 modes: transport mode and tunnel mode. So transport mode is host to host, tunnel mode is between gateways. Okay, so let me explain it in more detail. This is transport mode of HA. So in transport mode, you insert a header which has a MAC. Okay, so you take the packet and you insert a header which has a MAC. It's not called a MAC, it's called integrity check value, because you want to be original, you invent a new name for some existing mechanism. So this is ICV. There is a sequence number for anti-replay. And what is interesting is you also MAC part of the header. For example, source and destination, but not the hop count. Okay. In tunnel mode, you do something completely different. You take the packet as it is, and you make it a payload of a new packet. Okay, this is what's done in the gateway-to-gateway scenario. The gateway gets your packet and says, this is my new payload, and makes a new packet to put it in there. And this packet, of course, has a new IP header. So you have 2 headers. And then you also have this HA to protect, in fact, the whole IP header. So in fact, you can actually now protect the hop count and so on, because as your packet is sitting inside a bigger box, it will not be touched in the transmission from gateway to gateway. Okay, so you can now protect the whole gamut of the header. And of course, you'll also protect part of the new IP header. For example, it will protect the address of the gateway, source gateway and destination gateway, but not the hop count between those. So this is less efficient, but of course, this would have been enough, right? You could also have used this host to host. There have been a bit of overkill, but if you want a simple protocol, you would do it like this every time, but they decided to have both the tunnel and transport mode. ESP has a whole series of algorithms allowed. Needs some padding, so, but again, there is transport mode. In transport mode, you actually first add a trailer, so you pad out your block. This is needed for block cipher encryption. You need a multiple of the block length. You encrypt the whole stuff, and then you insert the header, and you append the MAC, which is called ICV. So now in this case, the MAC is not computed on the IP header at all. So even if the encryption algorithm is the identity, you don't encrypt, then ESP is not the same as HA, because the MAC here only covers the ESP header and the plain text. It doesn't cover the IP header. Okay. So ESP, you can actually use it with null encryption. This exists. It's not the same as HA. It's yet another variant of with slightly different goals. And I guess as an exercise, you can now derive the most complex transform, the ESP tunnel mode, where you take the data. The whole packet becomes a payload of a new packet, which gets a trailer, a header, and then you MAC the whole stuff. So in this case, in fact, the IP header is MAC'd, but of course not this IP header. Okay. So you see you have 4 combinations, so there's plenty of occasions to get things wrong. And what to choose, and so on and so on. So I guess the consensus is that this would have been enough, right? There is in fact no reason except for performance and export rules and whatever to, if they just would have stuck to this one, they could have met any application at the cost of efficiency. But I think ideally, if security is important, I think efficiency should be trumped by security. But of course, in the real world, it's very different. In the real world, efficiency trumps security. And if you can shave off a few bytes or make it slightly faster, you'll go for the other decision. And if the security suffers, well, that's the problem for my successor, right? I mean, that's not my problem. So you can actually use this with null encryption. So null encryption is defined. And then you have the encapsulating security payload without encryption, which is very similar to H8 in tunnel mode. But not identical. So IPsec, believe it or not, also allows to encrypt without macking. And in fact, there is Cisco documentation from a couple of years old which says that for performance reasons, it's fine to just encrypt and not mac. Okay? So this is very stupid. So I think I told you already earlier this week that I cannot see any reason why you would want to encrypt something without macking it. And so Kenny Patterson, together with another student a couple of years ago, he showed that if you have an ESP packet which is encrypted and not macked, you can actually do some CBC manipulations. Okay? And as a consequence, you take an encrypted packet, and instead of sending it to the destination, the router will send it back to the attacker, decrypted. Okay, so you're actually going to change, using CBC style attacks, you're going to change the destination address, so the router or the gateway will decrypt the packet and then send it back to the attacker in clear text. So, and only when they saw this, I mean, it was predicted, right, that this kind of things would happen, but only if somebody really goes in and spends the weeks and months of effort to find this hack, they may say, oh, there is a problem. You actually should always encrypt and mac. Okay? And I guess this advice has now disappeared from the books. So key management of IPsec is incredibly complex. I don't think I fully understand it. I don't have time to lock myself up for 3 weeks and to really try to understand it. So I've been on the mailing list for, I think now 18 years, but I still don't understand the whole protocol. And there is many things on the mailing list I don't have a clue what they're talking about. So maybe it's me, I'm not smart enough, but in any case, I can tell you it's not easy. Okay? So to make your life easier, if you have a small network, you can just install keys manually. Oof. That works always. Okay? So there is, of course, the default thing for a large network is automated. And of course, instead of designing a key management protocol, they designed a meta key management protocol. Okay, that sounds much cooler because it has to serve for anything. So there is actually a general framework. And then in this framework, there is mechanisms. And there is, in fact, two. There is a first phase mechanism and a second phase mechanism. There was a lot of effort being done to implement this protocol. In the end, there is nice security proofs for the protocol. But one thing they've carefully avoided to do is to give credit to Wiener, Hellman, and von Oschot. These people invented station-to-station in '92, so they figured out that if you sign Diffie-Hellman, then you actually get a secure protocol that achieves everything you want. But so they carefully avoid ever giving those people credit. And especially the people involved, they were all very keen to get their name associated to that protocol. Okay? And so this gave rise to religious battles between Oakley and Scheme. And in the end, and there was also Skip and so on. In the end, there was a solution worked out with a compromise between all those things. But they never mentioned the station-to-station word, because that's a dirty word in IETF, right? You should not give credit to the people who come up with the basic idea. So there is 5 exchanges, and there is reasons for this. So you first establish a secure channel, unauthenticated, and then inside this channel you authenticate. So this is actually nice because communicating, or attackers cannot see who's talking to whom, because you first have an unprotected Diffie-Hellman, and then inside this you protect. And then of course Diffie-Hellman is expensive, so there is a main mode where you do a new public key exchange, and there's aggressive mode where you do an exchange based on the old symmetric key. It's not so secure, but it's more efficient. Okay? And the same thing is for phase 2. You also have a quick mode and a normal mode. Okay? So, and then when they were almost done, this is like 96, 97, the first denial of service attacks started appearing. Then they quickly added kind of a cookie mechanism to stop denial of service attacks. So it's not very elegant. It was not conceived from the beginning. Okay? And so you negotiate the algorithm, encryption algorithm, the hash algorithm, authentication method, and they have 5 Diffie-Hellman groups at that time. They probably now have more. If it's complex, don't blame me, right? This is what it is. So I'm not going to explain this here, but essentially this is Diffie-Hellman in a different notation. So G to the X, G to the Y. Then from now on you have a key, so you can encrypt everything. And the main innovation compared to station is that you compute a PRF, a random function, on the nonces, which are not there in station to station, and on a Diffie-Hellman exchange to derive a key. And then from this, and then also what you do here in the signature, you actually hash again the identities, which is a flaw in station to station, because they're not present identities in this hash, and the Diffie-Hellman exchanges. Okay. So there is some subtle reasons why you have identities here and why you go to these stages with nonces. So this is anti-clogging, so there is some changes to station, which are actually well justified. This is indeed the Rolls-Royce of the protocols. So if you ever need a protocol, use this one. It has all the features you may want. It's also quite expensive. Okay? So this is the main, more secure protocol without all the optimization. This is the main protocol to establish a key and authenticate identities. So if you need to steal a protocol, use this one. Okay? Steal this out of IPsec. This is a really good one. So IKE version 1 was too complex. So after 7 years, they realized that they had to simplify it. I guess nobody could make it work. I don't know what the reason was. It was too complex and too expensive. So they had many extensions defined as well over the years. So net traversal, legacy authentication, remote address acquisition, and so on, which are not in the basic document. So if you had to understand IKE version 1, you had to look at many documents. And so they wanted to simplify things, optimize stuff, and put everything in one document. Okay? So the marketing is that it's as good as the previous one, but simpler. And I guess it got a little bit simpler. So as I said, it's 2 stages again. So you first negotiate algorithms and do Diffie-Hellman exchange, and then you authenticate within this session encrypted under the previous key. That's more or less what you do. So it still has this 2 stage. So in the second stage, you tell the other party who you are, which you hide in the first stage, and you prove who you are. Okay. And so you establish a first secure association. So I'm afraid that you may be disappointed because I didn't explain you the whole protocol. But I hope that by explaining to you how complex it is, you forgive me for not doing this. So if you want to find out, you go read the RFCs and allocate a few weeks. Okay? It's just complex. And there is reasons for it. If you want to make a protocol that works for any internet mechanism and supports any optimization needed and looks at any use case, then you end up with something very complex. Okay? So it's a committee design, so ESP in terminal mode would have been enough. The key management, I think many people are very disappointed that IKE version 2 was not simpler. They could have cut out some other stuff and made a really simple and elegant protocol. So I guess the problem is, if people look at implementations, they mostly look at SSL implementations because SSL is already very complex, but if you want to break stuff as a cryptographer, SSL is widely used. It's more used than IPsec. And everybody uses OpenSSL, right? So if you find a flaw in OpenSSL, you get attention. While IPsec, there is very few open source. There is OpenSwan, there is one, but in fact, there is many closed source implementations, and they're much more complex. So studying those implementations is a lot harder, because the protocol is more complex and thus the software is more complex. So, but I would believe that if people had more time and would study IPsec implementation, they'd probably uncover more flaws. So I don't think the IPsec implementations have had the same level of scrutiny as the SSL implementations. But if I look as a security purist, as a cryptographer, I would say the IPsec people, they took 5 years instead of 1 year. They achieved probably their goal better, right? For many of your use cases, they have a better solution. SSL is still a little bit quick and dirty and later on patch. While IPsec people, you can say it's too complex, but at least it's not quick and dirty patching. It's a more, I would say, more solid design, which is better analyzed. So, and I guess I already told you this. So in spite what you may read in some manuals, don't ever use IPsec ESP mode without macking. Okay, so that went quite fast. So I guess the idea is not to explain you all the details, because I guess you figured out by now that explaining you all the details of SSL would take about 6 to 8 hours. And I guess IPsec maybe 2 days to really, really understand all the options. But I try to give you more like a helicopter view. So you've seen the pluses and minuses of both. You see that both protocols have flaws. And I guess the biggest flaw of IPsec is the complexity. It's not really a flaw, it's a design decision to make it very complex because it covers all the use cases. So I guess then, of course, configuring it is probably very complex. But because it can do many things and it can be configured in many ways, if you have to secure a complex network, probably IPsec will do a very good job, right? If you take the time to do it all properly. So this comes back to the VPN issue. So the main motivation for IPsec, so you have all your devices on an open network and you want to actually have the logical equivalent of a closed network. And I guess we are moving already in the last decade past this defend the firewall and inside everything is secure. So I guess we now understand that everybody comes with their own iPads and iPhones and their own laptops. So even in security companies, I'm actually shocked. This is the biggest news I heard last week. So of course, when the iPad came out, the interesting thing was that the CEO of the company walked in after Christmas and said to the IT people, please hook this up to the internet, right? That was I mean, something I almost fell from my chair when I heard this, right? All these companies had like these rigid closed devices where you would never even dare to bring your own machine to the office. And the day the CEO came with the iPad, you know, everybody had to have this. And then this guy told me, this was CEO of a very large security company, which I cannot name. He said, you know what I find annoying? All my company mail is now mixed with my private mail. Yeah, well, if you bring an iPad and you want to have all your stuff on there. So this is a very interesting development. I think now the companies, this is now a few years later, the companies are even at the next stage. Even in security companies, they tell their employees, you know, we're not going to buy you a phone anymore or a laptop, bring your own and we'll pay you a fixed fee per month to bring your own stuff. So in fact, even if you say, you know, I don't like this, the fact that I have to manage a company machine and I'm in charge and so on, in fact, you have to now in security companies. So this is actually a very interesting development. Then, of course, you have all the consultants. So I guess this fact of having a secure network doesn't mean anything anymore. On your network, everybody is now untrusted, right? So in fact, in a company, you should use IPsec for every connection between every device. I think that's the logical consequence of telling people, bring your own boxes, right? But I'm not sure these consequences are being taken. This is going to be a few more years before industry realizes that there is really a bigger problem than you think. Okay. And if I asked for the motivation of this, and the answer was simple: cost. To save money, they actually tell people that, you know, BlackBerries, give back your BlackBerries and bring your whatever cheap Android phone, because we don't want to invest in security anymore. We don't want to manage those phones and give you a new one every 2 years. Bring your own device and we'll make it secure. Yeah, sure. Okay, so remote access, connecting networks, and computers. I already discussed those use cases, so I don't think I should spend too much time on them. I guess the new use case is probably change your mindset. Everybody walks in the company with devices which are untrusted, and hopefully, as a first step, you start encrypting all connections, right? Because you can no longer assume that inside the company you have a secure zone and you only have to start encrypting stuff from the firewall or the gateway onwards. But I don't think we're there already. Okay, so this is the remote access case where you prefer that actually you log into the gateway so that everything then here can go in clear. But then, of course, the problem is if this guy, this is a very old PC, but if this is an iPad and he walks inside the company, you also want encryption there, right? And so it can now be done. The use case of connection over the internet, I guess, is still very important. I don't know whether you can still even get leased lines these days. And then, of course, internet, which is becoming more and more important because you have actually the insecure devices. You hopefully can encrypt everything inside your network as well. I'll skip this. And so time to give the conclusions. So there is an important typo on this slide. So IPsec should be capital IP and small SEC. If you misspell it, then they really see that you're not a real guy, right? If you can't spell IPsec, then that gives you away, okay? This is very important to take away from this lesson. It's how to spell IPsec. This is a typo. I apologize for it. So IPsec is really transparent, and so this is really what we should try to implement. SSL is good for your HTTPS connections, your maybe email. You can use it for other things, for POP and so on, for FTP if you want to. But really, you should think of switching to IPsec for everything, especially given the new BYOD environment. IPsec works, but it's complex. And my prediction is in the next 5 years, people will start looking at more implementations and find more flaws. But that's not the reason to cook up your own, right? SSH and PGP, I guess this is more for the security people. I like this stuff, but I don't think you can sell this to the average user. They've also been now reasonably well studied. So there is more research in the security of it and security implementations. So you can say network security, as I started, is the easy problem. But I hope you understand that from what I told you this morning, it's actually the quite hard problem. So the fragmentation problem we only discovered a year ago. That if you have fragmentation, a protocol which was secure no longer is secure. Okay? So there is all this renegotiation problem. We still don't understand very well like how to specify algorithms so that you can't misread a key from one algorithm to another and all these kind of things. And there is secure implementation. So I guess as a major point of attention is random number generation. So what we've seen last year with these RSA attacks is the problem has been pointed out, but is there a good solution? And personally, I found the most shocking story the fact that these Taiwanese citizens, the government buys a common criteria certified identity card, and it turns out that even those cards don't have secure key generation. So then you start thinking that we're in shit, right? I mean, if even the common criteria, which are slow and expensive and rigorous, don't give you a guarantee that your random number generators are good, well, I think it's a challenge for all security people to do better and to avoid all those mistakes. But at least you should try to avoid to assume that all your building blocks are secure. So I guess a patch to this could be to add in your smart card other extra software that generates keys based on the randomness from the hardware generator and from your own randomness. Okay, then at least you have some protection. So, but don't assume that what you get is secure. And this is kind of the bad news. But the good news is I think we're learning. Okay, I have some references here. I haven't checked because there is not many books about IPsec, for example, that are updated. So there is a very good book on TLS from Rescola, one of the co-designers, but in fact it's quite outdated and it doesn't have any of the new attacks. Also, this book was never updated. I guess Stellings, he keeps producing new editions of his book. So at least there you can find the latest stuff. I like his book very much, but I don't like the crypto part of his book too much. But the network security part is very complete and very detailed and very instructive. So this is, I think if you want to learn about network security, get the 6th edition of his book. That would be my advice. That's a good starting point to figure out. And I hope that maybe some people will write better books taking into account the state of the art in IPsec and TLS. But as far as I know, there are none today. So, okay.